Let us no longer delay. Let's give a warm GRAR welcome to Rick Brodisky.
Well, good morning or good afternoon. I like to come out in this area of town. I'm stuck out in Allendale or Muskegon most of the time, but I'm a big fan of Great Harvest Extreme Cinnamon Bread. Has anybody had that? It is really good, and I had to stop there before that. But anyway, I wanted to talk about PFAS, and I've been doing environmental work in the West Michigan area for quite a while, and I was concerned about PFAS being at the tannery because I knew that they use Scotchgard, and Scotchgard is almost pure PFAS. And I wrote a memo to the DEQ warning them about it, and nothing really happened. And the newspaper got a hold of the memo, and all of a sudden I'm getting requests to be on TV and requests to give comments in the paper and things like that. And you really don't realize that how your position in the community has been elevated until I get a annual pest inspection because I live out in the country, and the pest control operator comes to the door, and I open the door, and he said, "Aren't you the guy that was on TV last night?" So, but anyway, my goal here today is to talk to you about PFAS, and I'm going to cover 4 different areas about it. And what I'd like to, I'm going to be stopping in between each one of them for questions, but I'm trying to work on a public presentation about this. And I do very well talking with other academics, but we really need to talk to the general public about this. So I'm using you as a test audience. I already used a smaller group on this before, but I've modified the presentation and whatnot. So anyway, what we're going to be talking about are what are PFAS compounds, why are they a problem in the environment, why are PFAS compounds a concern in Kent County, what are the human health concerns and safe levels, and then what needs to be done in the future. So I'm going to kind of go through this, and then after each one of these we'll stop for some questions and see if I'm making sense or making no sense. This is the chemistry part. This is the stuff that I like, but a lot of people never liked chemistry as in high school. But anyway, PFAS means per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So these are organic compounds with fluorine in them. That's the main thing to know. And the 2 compounds that are in the news right now are PFOA and PFAS, and those are the names of them. I don't expect you to know those, but they're just 8 carbon chain compounds that are saturated with fluorine. And the one thing I wanted to make a point of is nature only makes 2 fluorinated compounds. So nature doesn't really like to use fluorine, and the 2 fluorinated compounds nature makes are poisonous and toxic. So it's not something that natural systems are used to seeing. So when chemists put fluorine on a molecule, the environment really doesn't know what to do with it. Now, the reason why chemists put fluorine on the molecule is the fluorine-carbon bond is really stable. So whatever these compounds they're making, the compounds will last a long time. They'll be very durable. And as you know, Teflon was the first PFAS compound that was synthesized, and that was considered a miracle compound for the space program. So they're space durable type compounds. So anyway, we're just finding out, though, that there's a lot of other issues associated with PFAS, but I wanted you to realize that it's the fluorine that makes them significant. And they've got 2 parts to them. They've got the one tail that's got fluorine, and then they've got a tail that has OH and oxygen on it. So this part dissolves in water, and it can lead to the compound being very mobile. So when people spill it, when people release it, it's very mobile in the environment. It's got this long chain here with the fluorines on it, and that repels water and it repels oil, so that's why it's good for stain protection and things like that. So it's a compound that you can attach with that group on here, and it will stick to different things, but then it will repel things at the same time. When it gets detached or when it's dumped into the water, this will actually dissolve in water. And very few pollutants that we deal with, except for nitrate, are water soluble. All the gasolines and the pesticides and things like that typically don't dissolve in water. And the fact that this one does dissolve in water makes it very significant. So the compounds, PFAS and PFOA, Teflon and Scotchgard, but there's a number of other materials that contain this particular compound. Stainmaster carpet. I remember moving to a house with Stainmaster carpet in the 90s, or in the 80s, and my son spilled grape juice on my white floral carpet, and I was able to clean it up. I was totally amazed about it. So everybody used it. I mean, it was a miracle type product. Simonize. Anybody use Simonize on your cars? You know, they had that commercial where you put it on your car and the water beads up. You know, that's because it had PFAS in it. So car washes are locations where people are concerned about PFAS. And Gore-Tex. You know, I did a lot of hiking and things like that. I'm a scoutmaster, and Gore-Tex was a miracle type material for bad weather gear, outdoor gear. And then the other big one is this firefighting foam called AFFF. And it's a mixture of different compounds. It contains PFAS and PFOA, but a lot of other ones in it. And it's the only product that really takes out jet fuel fires. So it's used a lot in the military, and it's really used a lot for the commercial aviation. And we actually, at the Ford Airport, we had a training site, so other people from different airports came to Grand Rapids to be trained on how to use this particular product. So these were all, you know, things that everybody used, everybody thought was good, but we've learned later that they weren't so good, I guess. I've got a whole list of different things that the PFAS compounds were put in. One of the big uses is fast food containers. So any type of greasy fast food, the PFAS was put in the wrappers and the containers. Butter wrappers had lots of PFAS. Microwave popcorn bags. A whole host of things. So we've had lots of exposures outside of what we've gotten from water or contacting the Rogue River or something here. So we have a large background of PFAS in our blood already, and that's what is concerning to scientists, because anytime you have something that builds up in your blood, it's not a good situation. And I'll leave a copy of these slides behind, and they can distribute them if you're interested in looking at them in the future. So why are PFAS compounds a problem in the environment? Let's stop right here. Does anybody have any questions on what PFAS is? It's fluorinated things that last forever, and we all use them. So you know, that's pretty much, you know, why we have an issue with the environment. So let's talk about why they're a problem in the environment. Long history of widespread use. They've been in use since the 1940s, and they've been in use since the 1950s in the Rockford area. They're specifically designed to be resistant and long-lasting. They were not regulated or tested for until recently. So when you start looking at the history, and I've got a timeline that I'll go through in a minute, you kind of wonder why this stuff was hushed up, why it was not brought out, because you know, we've heard a lot about pesticides and a lot about other lead and things like that, but why did this one kind of slip through the cracks? And the reason why it was not regulated or tested until you know, probably the last 10 years. They do not behave like common pollutants. They don't stick to soil very well. They dissolve in water. Most common pollutants stick to soil and do not dissolve. So these things are mobile, and that's what really raises one flag. And we're also reacting to historical releases from the 60s and 70s. So whenever we find these compounds in the environment, they've spread quite a distance. They've spread for miles in certain cases. And the PFAS compounds are slightly heavier than water, so they kind of sink to the bottom of an aquifer. And when there's gravel and things like that, there's gravel river channels that can actually go under a river and come out the other side. That's what happened up in Van Etten Lake. The PFAS from Wordsmith Air Force Base actually went under the lake and came up on the other side. So it's testing our ability to track things from a hydrogeological standpoint. And what bothers the toxicologists is that it remains in the circulation and instead of residing in the fat. So, things like pesticides and PCBs and mercury will reside in, pesticides and PCBs reside in fat, lead resides in the bone, and mercury goes into muscle tissue. But this one stays in the blood. So we're extra concerned about anything that lasts a long time and stays in your blood. You have a question?
Can I ask you a question about the spreading of PFAS? You have right here that it's already spread long distances. So that's my question is, we can test today, but tomorrow, could it be there? Like how long do you trust the test for? And how far can it spread and how long will it keep spreading?
Well, it doesn't spread like in a river, but if you have a site, and you've got, I'll get into hydrogeology in a little bit. So maybe let me just ask your question. I'll answer your question in the next few minutes.
Thank you.
So, but anyway, these are all the reasons why we're concerned. And the big one that everybody is concerned about from a health standpoint is that it stays in our blood. And we'll find out what. Yes.
Can your blood be tested for the?
Yes, it can. Yes. And there are very few labs that do it, but there was just an article last night where the state is testing 800 people in this area. So they're testing 400 that are high-level exposures and 400 that should not. So. And it's also significant at low exposure levels in the part per trillion range. So we're dealing with something very, very small, and people aren't used to that. But being in the real estate business, everybody is familiar with radon. And radon, you're dealing with just a few particles. Nobody expresses them in parts per trillion, but you're dealing with very, very small amounts of something that's very, very poisonous. So if you can talk to people about radon, we should be able to talk about this in a rational manner. For some reason, everybody's used to radon, everybody's heard about it. This is something new, and people are more concerned about it. But I am personally more concerned about radon than this particular compound, low levels of it. I want to kind of walk through this timeline, and it's pretty interesting. In 1956, 3M started selling the PFAS and PFOA. Wolverine made Hush Puppies, which was really groundbreaking innovation of putting Scotchgard on pigskin and making a waterproof shoe. Nobody else did that. And Wolverine worldwide became the largest leather tanning industrial consumer of Scotchgard. And at one time, they bought half of all the Scotchgard sold in the United States. So they were a big user of it. Fast forward 20 years, 3M started to find it in the blood, and there was some toxicity tests that was toxic to monkeys. In 1998-99, studies found it present in blood and wildlife outside of the factory. Reports of toxicity and bioaccumulation were published in the literature. In 1999, 3M notified Wolverine worldwide of worker health concerns and about Scotchgard, and they told them that they were discontinuing production of it. They announced a formal discontinuation of it in 2000, and in 2001, there was a study by a professor at Michigan State University that found it distributed worldwide in birds and wildlife. So by the year 2000, pretty much the word was out that this chemical was a bad chemical. And unlike lead and PCBs, there was not a widespread testing and analysis for it. So I can't explain why we didn't look for it. It just kind of died out. When in 2002, they discontinued the Scotchgard, and they came up with a different formulation. It's still fluorinated, and we still have concerns about the newer versions of Scotchgard. In 2006, DuPont announced they would phase out Scotchgard. by 2015. So they were making it a much longer time than PM was. EPIC study in 2007, 98% of the blood samples in the U.S. had PFAS, PFOA in them, but the levels were decreasing after they started discontinuing in production. 2008, the EPA published a test method for it. 2009, they put out a advisory. 2012, they had a requirement for drinking water, and lo and behold, Plainfield Township had a pretty high level of it in one of their wells. 2015, the EPA reported, or the DEQ reported PFAS in fish from the Rogue River, and that's where I became concerned, because if it's in the fish, then it's got to be in the water, and the tannery used Scotch Guard, so it's pretty easy to put together a connection between the two. 2013 was, oh, I didn't revise the slide. 2016, we had the long-term numbers published by the EPA, the guidelines of 70 parts per trillion. So that's the one that everybody's familiar with. That came out, just in 2016. They detected Plainfield PFAS in Plainfield well water at about 8 parts per trillion, and PFOA at 3 parts per trillion. So there was a lot of concern about it. Even though the safe level was 70, there were a lot of people that were concerned about that. And Plainfield went on to put, in 2018, to put in activated carbon treatment. In 2016, though, we found high levels at House Street site. 2017, widespread groundwater problems all over Rockford, and Wolverine Worldwide wastes were applied on farmland and in gravel pits throughout Kent County. And late in 2017, they also found it at the airport. 2018's been a busy year, too. There was this ATSDR report that everybody heard was suppressed and finally released. I'll talk a little bit about that, but that's recommending lowering the concentrations down to about 12 parts per trillion. So right now, the DEQ is testing 1,300 water sources in Michigan, and every week we read about a few areas, Ionia County, Kalamazoo, Parchment, that have PFAS in them. The biggest surprise to me was that City of Grand Rapids water has 3.14 parts per trillion of PFAS in it. So I was always thinking that we could pipe in Lake Michigan water and be rid of the compound, but there's going to be a small amount of it in everybody's drinking water. Everybody's been drinking a small amount of it. So, and we'll talk about whether that's significant or not. But I thought that was a very, and they also confirmed it by Wyoming's got about the same level. So it appears that whether it's the Grand River plume affecting the water treatment or Lake Michigan is at 3 to 4 parts per trillion. So our challenges with this compound are it's highly mobile and persistent in the environment. Solubility is grams per liter. It bioaccumulates 10,000 times in fish and 500 to 1,000 times in plants. And it's challenging to remediate because it doesn't break down. Only activated carbon takes it out. And activated carbon does not remove the newer forms of PFAS. So there's it's called PBS. That's the replacement. That's got a 4-carbon chain. That's not removed very well. Gen X is the replacement for the firefighting foam, and it doesn't remove that very well either. So the larger the carbon chain of the molecule, the better it's removed. The smaller, it's not removed. So the only way to take it out is put in wells around the perimeter and then suck the water out. And that's, when you have a situation that's spread for 40 years, you really can't go after everything that's escaped. You can just go after the area right near the zone where things were deposited. And there are very high levels at the tannery and very high levels at House Street. And they're doing an investigation at Boulder Creek as we speak. So does anybody know why we have issues with PFAS in terms of health? It's got known or suspected toxicity at very low concentrations. It binds to proteins and DNA, long half-life, and very sensitive receptor endpoints, so it resembles fatty acids. So these are the toxicology issues of why we have concerns about PFAS. And I like to show this picture because when I was going to school, all molecules were one dimension, just like sticks. But as we've learned, molecules are folded and everything else. And PFAS is just the right size to bind into proteins. It's the right size to bind into DNA. So it sticks, just like it makes polymers and things like that. It sticks to DNA molecules and it sticks to proteins in our blood. So that's not a good situation. And the fact that it resembles fatty acids, it's linked to high cholesterol. So these are all reasons why we're concerned about the toxicity of it. And these present real challenges to research because it's not just a simple chemical reaction. It's a three-dimensional reaction that you're trying to model. So, all the beautiful stick molecules that I grew up with, I've got to deal with this kind of stuff now. So, I have trouble with, Anyway, analytical technology is rapidly evolving, and we can, like I said, measure parts per trillion. When the water was tested in 2013, they were at like 30 or 40 parts per trillion. Now we're down to 1, so we can see very low levels, and we have this wide geographic impact. The last issue is it's transported from soil into plants. Plants have proteins and lipids, and the PFAS dissolves in them. So a lot of the Wolverine sludge was applied to land. A lot of it was, applied to corn, and people ate the corn. So we have a whole exposure in this area that we don't know much about. And it's just historic. We can't go back and measure it anymore in people. But any farm where this was applied, where the corn was fed to animals and we ate the animals or drank the milk, we probably got PFAS in our bodies from that exposure. So in terms of chemical challenges in water, nobody would think of putting a well in a city. Everybody realizes that, when we have developments and things like that, dense developments and different mixed uses and things like that, that nobody would think of putting a well in the city of Grand Rapids. So what we have to get to is thinking about where we've got PFAS put in certain areas. We just can't have wells in those areas anymore. And we had a permitting process that left us putting wells near old landfills. That was a very bad idea. Putting schools near old landfills, putting public water near landfills. So we just have to change the way we're dealing with that. Everybody has PCBs in their body. Everybody has mercury in their body. We have areas in Michigan that have high arsenic. We had formaldehyde in air, the urea formaldehyde foams that were a problem, and radon. The common issue with all of these is that the background exposures are similar to risky levels. So we've got to get used to dealing with something that we're concerned about at a low level, and the background is pretty close. So when I mentioned that Grand Rapids has 3 parts per trillion of PFAS in the drinking water, the newest level, we'll talk about that a little bit later, the newest level from ATSDR, that the suppressed report is recommending 12. So we're getting closer to the level of concern. So these are challenges, though, that we've dealt with. I mean, we've went to public water, and for some reason, mercury in the fish doesn't bother a lot of people. It bothers me, but we can't eat a single fish in Michigan. You get your fishing license, and you've got all those, don't eat this and don't eat that. So we're just going to have to get more used to talking about this problem and dealing with it. The way we're exposed, and I mentioned that we all have PFAS in our blood, we can get exposed through dusts and fibers. So couches treated with Stainmaster, some of the fire extinguishers that we bought, that people buy that are used for grease fires, have that AFFF in it. Shoes, clothing, food packaging. It can go from plants to animals and come into our food system, air and water. So we're getting it from a lot of different areas. We're getting exposed to it. So the question is, why are we so concerned about water? And I'll try and answer that in a minute. Even though we're getting exposed from multiple different areas, there's something unique about the water exposure. We'll learn that in a minute. But before I leave this part, whenever you read a news article, people talk about parts per trillion. And I just kind of wanted to explain what a part per trillion was. Part per trillion is 1 part in 1 trillion parts of another medium. So 1 part in 1 trillion parts of water. And I like this analogy here, talking about it, where if you had a dollar bill is 1 gram. So if you cut that into 1,000 pieces, you'd have 1 milligram. And if you cut one of those pieces up into 1,000 pieces, you'd have 1 microgram. And if you cut that one of those microgram pieces up into 1,000 pieces, you'd have 1 part per trillion. So it's a very, very small amount. And you see things like 1 second in 32,000 years, or 1 grain of sand in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Those are all good analogies, but they kind of make you think that it's insignificant. And I just wanted to mention that is 1 part per trillion significant? For most chemicals, no. Lead, other things that we deal with, it's not significant. For chemicals that bioaccumulate, yes. Mercury and PCBs are present at those levels in water, and they accumulate so we can't eat our fish. So they are significant. For chemicals that affect the endocrine system, yes. And as I go in for medical tests and things like that, I get tested for the PSA, prostate antigen, and that's all in nanograms per milliliter. That's in very low concentrations. So hormone systems in our body are used to seeing very, very low levels. And the normal range for parathyroid is 10 to 65 parts per trillion. The normal range for T3 thyroid is 2 to 4 parts per trillion. And ACTH, pituitary hormone, is 10 to 60 parts per trillion. So, you know, even though it's a small amount, for certain things it's significant. And we're still trying to feel our way as to what is significant about those low levels. But I don't, when anybody says, you know, it's parts per trillion, you know, don't worry about it. There are things that are significant in your body, and we're still learning a lot more about the significance of parts per trillion. But remember, PFAS compounds accumulate 100-fold from blood, from drinking water. So we're going to hear more about this. But when you drink water, it's very easily absorbed. It binds to proteins in your blood, and your blood level is 100 times what you drink. So that's why we're going lower and lower, because of the fact that it circulates in our blood. So, does anybody have any questions on why it's significant in the environment? Yes.
Well, it's not really in regards to that, but it's the plain filled. You mentioned they put in a filter.
Yes.
I've read a little bit about that, and people have said that it only filters like part of the water. Like, how effective do you think it is?
Well, it filters. It removes the PFAS. The question is, are there other things in the water? And that's what people are concerned about in Plainfield because of the proximity to the dump where the wells are. So it does remove PFAS.
What was the question?
What filter?
We didn't hear your question.
There was a question about Plainfield, that the carbon filter in Plainfield doesn't remove all the pollutants. And that's true. It does not. It removes PFAS very well, but if there's other things in the water, it will not remove it. So, yes.
How are they disposing, how do you dispose of, and where do you dispose of the carbon filters when you have to change them?
They send the carbon back to the company, and they burn the material off and then resell it. It's recycled. But they can't dump it anywhere. It's not dumped anywhere. So, yes.
What's your health impact slide? That was kind of more at a molecular level. I'm curious, and you might get to this.
I'm getting into that later. Yep. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah. I just wanted to make you understand why they're serious, and the take-home points of it is it bioaccumulates, so small levels turn into larger levels in animals, and it's also something that circulates in the blood and jumps up 100-fold when we drink it. So, yes.
You mentioned the level in the Grand Rapids water was 3 point something, that you were surprised by that. Were you expecting it to be higher or lower? What made you
Lower.
surprised?
I would think that, Lake Michigan's big enough to dilute it all out.
Okay, so you thought it was higher.
Yep. Yes.
You got one extreme from our wonderful media talking about everything is toxic, and other people said it's no big deal.
Yeah.
We as real estate agents,
I'll try to answer some of those questions as we go on. So I'm getting into I'm talking about Kent County, and then I'll talk about health. So, yes.
Does radon in water bioaccumulate as well?
Well, radon in water, and thinking about it, I should have probably drawn more comparisons to that. Radon is toxic at very low parts per trillion levels. I mean, very low amounts of radon in the air are toxic, and that's a known carcinogen. PFAS is a suspected carcinogen. So we actually know for a fact that if you inhale radon at a certain level and you also smoke, that your risk of getting cancer goes way up. All this other stuff is hypothetical. It's hypothetical for a good reason, but radon to me is a much more serious pollutant. It doesn't bioaccumulate, no.
Okay, I'm speaking about radon in water, though.
Radon in water is not a concern. It's radon that we breathe. It's absorbed through the lungs very efficiently, yes.
I have a question. What are the consequences of that for the body? Like, what are the diseases?
I'll get into that. I'll talk about that in a minute. But I just wanted to get past the point of why we're concerned about it, so that everybody can see why we're concerned about it. All right. PFAS in Kent County, why should we be concerned about it? Regional geology. We have a very unique geology in Plainfield, Belmont area that really makes the land susceptible to PFAS and PFAS contamination. We have lots of sand and gravel. We have water that moves relatively fast. My well's in the Marshall Formation. I live in Allendale Township, and my water moves at inches per decade. I mean, it moves really, really slow. This one will move in 20 to 30 feet per year, so it will move much faster, and could even move faster if it's gravel. So, and sand doesn't retain things. My well is beneath, hundreds of feet of clay, and this, the wells go right through sand. So we have a unique regional geology that's more susceptible to PFAS contamination than most places. We have historic high usage from the tannery. We have ineffective regulations and enforcement. You heard about Boulder Creek, and there was actually a monument there, don't do anything, and they built a golf course on it. And I don't know why those things happened, but we were very ineffective in terms of enforcing regulations. Very rapid development. Grand Rapids is a desirable place. All the hills in Rockford, the fresh water of the Rogue River, really a place where people want to live. Water resources are a key of our local community and economy. The Grand River is a big part, Lake Michigan. I mean, people come here because of the water. So anything that's contaminated in the water is a big concern. So in terms of area geology, you look at glacial history. There are two glacial lobes, the Michigan lobe and the Saginaw lobe. They came together, and that area where the two glaciers came together runs right through Belmont and Plainfield. So you had two glaciers melting at the same time, and you had just thousands and millions of gallons of water, and the water sorts particles, so it washes all the clay and the heavy or the light stuff away and leaves gravel and boulders and things like that. So we have tons of gravel here, and that's because of those two glacial lobes that came together. So gravel is great because you can pump a lot of water from it, but when it's not protected by clay layers and things like that, it gets contaminated. We have outwash channels, and there's a lot of geology here, but when you looked at what happened at House Street, the water went south, and then it went, I think, went to the east. And it went into an old outwash channel from a river, and it was carried down that river channel. So when we start looking at where these dumps are and how they move, it's pretty complicated because it's very different. The environment is very heterogeneous. You have different layers of gravel, layers of sand, you have some clays in there, and it's all mixed up. So it's very susceptible but very difficult to characterize. And you can look at the pink areas, that's all sand and gravel deposits, and you can see Plainfield Township and whatnot. So that's why we have lots of gravel pits. And it's great for water, it's great for fresh water, but it gets contaminated fairly easily. So we have complex and variable geology and rapid transit times. So that's why Kent County is having the problems that it's having. And very productive and vulnerable aquifer systems. So it's not unreasonable for communities to take water out. I mean, it's very cheap for them to take water. They don't want to hook up to Lake Michigan and have the money of pumping the water all the way here. So we were relying on that resource, but that resource has been contaminated. The tannery was in business from 1908 to 2010. It was demolished in 2011. And the Rogue River is a scenic trout river. So, not the best location for the tannery, but the Rogue River is certainly a resource that people come to this area to fish on. They used bark and chromium tanning in the 1940s, so there's issues with chromium tanning waste left on the site. And then they made the hush puppies in 1958 with Scotchgard. They had a wastewater plant that was built in 1968, so the wastes were going into the river before that. The wastewater was discharged to the city of Rockford, and then later to the city of Grand Rapids. The city of Rockford took its drinking water downstream from the factory from 1925 to 1999. So again, there's another potential exposure that nobody can go back and look at, but the Rockford was getting water from the Rogue River. And then 3M notified Wolverine in 1999, so it was discontinued. So there's this whole process of having this large industrial complex producing waste. And one thing, when you look at the engineering of tannery waste, there's 850 kilograms of solid waste for every 1,000 kilograms of hides processed. So for every 1 gram or 1 pound of hides, they almost get 3/4 of a pound of waste for each one of those. So the amount of waste a large tannery produces is large, and they continuously have to go places to dump it. So when they were producing shoes for that long, they've had to go to a lot of different places. And gravel pits are good, ravines are good, not good, but I mean there's places where those kinds of wastes get dumped. But this type of a business produces a lot of waste. And in terms of groundwater, we have confined aquifers and unconfined aquifers. Confined aquifers are ones that the water percolates down and gets trapped beneath above a clay layer. And then a confined aquifer has a continuous layer of clay that protects transport of water. We can do very simple measurements. Actually, we look for tritium. And tritium was released during the atomic bomb testing in the 50s. And if we find that in well water, then we know that it's exchanged since the water from the surface has gotten in there since 1950. If we look at confined aquifer that's protected by clay, that material wouldn't get in there. So it's a pretty easy test to determine whether you're in a confined or an unconfined aquifer. And the city of Rockford right now is in a confined aquifer. So they have a good, dependable drinking water source. It's just confined aquifers, don't have the permeability and the production capability as unconfined aquifers do. So they're looking for water right now. And Plainfield Township is looking for water too. They're in a unconfined aquifer. So it's really important when you're looking at a house is how deep is the well, and then look at the well logs. And if you see clay layers, a significant clay layer, then you can say that it's a confined aquifer. If you see a small clay layer, then it's probably not a confined aquifer. So that's really important in terms of whether your house is contaminated. But yes?
What is the small clay layer versus a big?
Well, a big clay layer is hundreds of feet, whereas a small clay layer might be 10 feet.
Okay.
Because you can get perch layers that are small like that. But I live in Allendale Township, and I'm in a confined aquifer, but what's my problem? Production, right. It's got only a finite amount of production, so the level's going down. And then the other issue, not in Allendale Township, but in Talmadge, there was a lot of oil exploration. All those oil wells are rotting, and the brine is seeping up into the unconfined aquifer. So, we're impacting our water is the main takeaway. And then two little pictures about a plume. You often see something that looks like this, where you see a leak and then the water going downhill, follows the gradient, and then is intercepted by a river. But a plume is actually very complicated. It's three-dimensional. And that's why it's so hard to characterize the house street plume. The plume is very long, and it's both vertical and horizontal, so and in length. So when you look at the plume, it's not as simple as a textbook. It takes a lot of wells to characterize the plume, and we're going to be characterizing the house street plume for years, because you put in wells and you test, and then based on that data, you've got to go back and put in more wells and test again, and it takes a couple years to characterize a plume properly. So the answers are not always forthcoming. And then the other problem is, let's go back to this last picture. You have home wells. That's how we've been testing for PFAS, is checking people's houses. One person could have a deep well and have PFAS in it. One person could have a shallower well and not have it in. If this is closer to the landfill, this would have more. If this is further away, it wouldn't. But two wells next to each other, one can be contaminated and one cannot be contaminated. So, and not next to each other, hundreds of feet, but within a quarter of a mile of each other, definitely. So it's really hard to draw conclusions from the data that we're getting now from homes. You have to put in monitor wells. When you put in a monitoring well, you sample each one of those units and look for the water. So. Any questions on why Kent County is significant, why it's important to Kent County? It's the geology. And it's the geology. Everybody had clean water here, but this stuff is soluble and gets into the water table. So now we're going to get into health. And this is where it gets kind of hard to explain, but there's no direct relationship between blood levels and disease. So that's a pretty tough one for people to understand. That's where people say, well, it's not significant and things like that. But we're going to talk about some more detail about why, even though there's no correlation between blood levels and disease, it still is significant. Radon has a threshold level where adverse effects don't occur, and that's been actually studied. We're trying to determine what that is for PFAS. But most chemicals have, safe levels, and you just can't, go to a level where you have no radon. I mean, there's still radon in everybody's house. It's just, below a detection limit or below a safe level. So, and that doesn't bother people. But right now, 1 part per trillion bothers a lot of people. Lead in drinking water, people are talking about lowering that standard. PFAS compounds do show population effects. So when we expose populations, we get higher rates of disease. So we don't see it necessarily in an individual, but we see it expressed over a large population. So there was just a report that prostate cancer was higher in Kent County. There was a preliminary release of some epidemiological data, and that's what they did. They looked at people in that zip code area around House Street and a couple other spots, and they looked at 5 or 6 different types of, well, they looked at 10 different types of cancer, and prostate cancer was higher. So the question is it due to the landfill or not? And disease doesn't correlate with exposure amount either. So some people can be exposed to it and not get a problem, and some people can get exposed to smaller amounts and have problems. So it's not a straightforward toxicant like radon. But radon, believe me, is much more significant. I mean, if you have high radon levels, you have a very high likelihood of getting cancer. So, a little bit of toxicology. A gentleman named Paracelsus in the 1500s said all substances are poisons. There's none that's not a poison. The dose makes the poison. So that's pretty much true with all toxicants. Dose is the amount of chemical entering the body, and it's always expressed as milligrams per kilogram body weight. So if a child drinks water and you drink water, who gets a higher dose? The child, yeah. So that's important to remember. And dose is dependent on the concentration, the properties, whether it's absorbed like PFAS and things like that, the timing and frequency of the exposure, the length of exposure, and the pathway. So PFAS is accumulated through lung exposure and dust, and also through water ingestion. But these are all factors that have to be considered. And then you can have different effects. You can have local effects, systemic effects, reversible, non-reversible, immediate, delayed. And then these 2 ones are really interesting. Monotonic just is a straight, the more you intake, the more toxicity you have. And then non-monotonic, we have things like vitamins that are essential at low levels, but if you take too much vitamin D or something like that, you'll get sick from it. Selenium, we all have to have a little selenium. If we take too much, we get sick. And there's hormones. We have to have a certain amount of hormone. And if we don't have that amount of hormone, we get sick. But if we have too much of it, we get other types of illness. So it's just really complicated. So all of this is layering on top of how do we determine a safe level of PFAS. That's why I'm going through it. And the tough part about population toxicology is that populations show a bell-shaped curve, and we'll see that in a minute. There's a mean level, and then there's sensitive and insensitive organisms. So there's insensitive populations based on genetics, sex, and age. There's sensitive individuals based on the same characteristics and also developmental stage. There's occupational exposures in a population that people have more exposure. And then the health status based on age, obesity, diabetes. So when you look at a population, you have a whole bunch of other factors that are coming to play in there. And I'd like to use an example in terms of looking at a typical dose. This is the average population. Then you have insensitive and sensitive subjects. What do you think the most sensitive subject is in a population? Fetus and children, but and those are the ones that are the hardest to experiment. I mean, you can't really experiment on that. So what's driving the levels lower is concerns for fetal health, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then my 2 favorite examples of insensitive people, Keith Richards and Ozzy Osbourne. They actually had their genes tested, and they are more resistant to toxicity than other people. But you know, some people just can do that. But if I talk about ethanol, and I like this commercial. Drinking kills brain cells. What can you do after your brain cells are killed? Go into politics. But human risk perception is affected by the degree of pleasure or displeasure associated with a particular risk. And I'd like to talk about alcohol as a risk. And what type of chemical would you classify alcohol as being? I like craft beer and everything else, but it's a group 1 known carcinogen. If you drink lots of amounts of alcohol, you will get liver cancer. It's definitely a known human carcinogen. If I were to work with a known human carcinogen in my lab, I'd have to have all sorts of protections and things like that, vinyl chloride or some of the classics. But alcohol, for some reason, we don't consider that. It does exhibit the effect where small amounts are beneficial. There's a lot of studies supporting a glass of wine or a glass of beer a day is good for your cardiovascular system. But it's also a tetratogen. It causes fetal alcohol syndrome. So if you're pregnant and you drink, the alcohol will cause deformities in the offspring. And of all substances of abuse, including cocaine, heroin, marijuana, alcohol produces far more serious, the most serious neurobehavioral effects in the fetus. So, for some reason we don't consider fetal alcohol syndrome to be bad, but one in alcohol diffuses through the placenta. It concentrates in fetal blood, the same as the mother. The fetus is able to metabolize it slower, and 1 in 200 individuals are affected by prenatal alcohol exposure. So it's a really serious problem, but we don't necessarily deal with that the same way we're approaching the issue with these chemicals. And I just wanted to talk about why the fetus is so sensitive. The central nervous system is being put together or being formed in weeks 3 to 5. The heart in weeks 4 to 6 and 7, whatnot. The eyes. You can see that different systems are exposed. So the timing of that exposure gets to be really critical with these types of chemicals that affect the fetus. So this is why we're keeping going lower and lower, as we find that a large exposure or a significant exposure just during those couple of weeks might be toxic. How do you regulate against that? And how do you regulate against something that accumulates 100 times? So this is the challenge that we're dealing with, coming up with a safe level. As far as studies out there, there was this C8 study, and if you look into different studies, this one is always the first one that comes up. 69,000 people, and these were people that had contaminated water and also workers from the DuPont plant. So it had both residents and workers. And we also have the ATSDR study. That was the one that just came out recently that was supposedly suppressed and whatnot. But anyway, this ATSDR reviews all sorts of scientific studies and recommends a level. So this is specific for a large study, 69,000 people, and what the ATSDR does is review the body of literature. So this C8 study found that a probable link between high cholesterol, ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, testicular and kidney cancers, and pregnancy-induced hypertension. So it's not a direct link, but it's a probable link in the population. So people with higher PFAS exposure had more high cholesterol, had more ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, those types of cancers, but they couldn't relate it back to a certain level of exposure. So, and some people will look at that, the industry people look at that and say, well, there's no direct link. But, when you start building a level of a body of evidence of likely links and possibilities and probabilities, it gets to be more serious. And the ATSDR, in that recent study, they found developing fetus and child problems, changes in growth, learning behavior, low birth weight, accelerated puberty, and skeletal variations, hormone interferences, so that goes back to the thyroid issue, increased cholesterol, affects the immune system, and it also affects the vaccines. I think I've got that next. Well, maybe not. But if you have PFAS in your bloodstream, vaccines are less effective. So childs have higher exposure, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So again, we're coming back to this child and fetus scenario. Liver damage, this is the antibody resistance to vaccines, increased risk of asthma. So these are all the things that, fertility issues, so there's increased miscarriages. But these are all the things that they found links to by looking at the data. So some of those are really scary, and it's, again, something that you don't want to have in your water. And even if there's probable links, you want to err on the side of caution. There's a few other organizations found sufficient evidence about the low fetal growth, and that's been proven by 3 different organizations' studies. The kidney and testicular cancer comes out on top again, and this immunosuppression comes out again too. So a lot of vaccines, the antibiotics bind to proteins in your body, and those are the ones that this PFAS also binds to too, so there's a competitive reaction maybe. So here's what we're dealing with, the long half-life. Because it doesn't go away and it binds so tight to proteins, it takes 4 to 9 years for half of it to be excreted from your body. So the people on House Street, half of their levels will go down by 50% in 4 to 9 years. So that just shows you how it's retained in your body. The human kidney reabsorbs PFAS. All the rat kidneys and fish kidneys and things like that, they just spit it out, whereas our kidney sometimes likes to hold on to it. And when we go to the doctor and we get a blood test, they always look for albumin. That's the protein, and we've got to have lots of albumin because our body runs on that. And then if we have a urine test, they look for albumin in there, and if you find it, there's something wrong with you seriously. So the human kidney keeps that in the body more. For some reason, our species will reabsorb PFAS, and then it binds to proteins. So any study that's done with animals, if we repeated that study with humans, humans would get a 100-fold higher dose. So how do you model that? You can't test humans. So if you get a level with a rat, do you automatically multiply it by 100? I mean, these are things that regulatory people are looking at. I would multiply it by 100. But anyway. High material transfer to the fetus, too. So it's transferred just like alcohol across the placenta. And infants get higher exposure because they drink more water. You know, infants drink 4 liters of water a day. So 4 liters of water in a, small body versus 4 liters of water, or 2 liters of water in an adult. So that's, again, why these levels are going lower. It's found in amniotic fluid, umbilical fluid, breast milk. If you track serum levels, it's very similar to the mother's serum level, but then it increases several-fold during the first few months because of breastfeeding and drinking water. And exposure to infants is much higher than older individuals. So again, we're coming down to this very, it doesn't affect everybody, but it's with populations, this is the most sensitive part of the population. The good thing is the levels are going down. Right now, our average is 2 micrograms per liter. That's 2,000 parts per trillion in our blood. So we don't want to add to that, obviously, by drinking water. These are an example of some blood levels, and our U.S. population, DuPont workers had 410, 3M workers had 1,125. The infant in Belmont, there was a report of a 1.5-year-old boy, 500 micrograms per liter, the same level as a DuPont worker, 1.5 years old, just drinking the water. And then there's a Belmont resident with 2,000. She's twice the 3M worker just from drinking water. So the question is, what health problems are related to that? And then you get anecdotal evidence. Her husband died of cancer right before this was discovered. So, yes?
That kind of raises a question. Do you have any recommended resources for evidence-based practice of PFAS against human health in the greater Grand Rapids area that you could recommend?
What do you mean by resources?
Do you have any sort of different websites like the CDC or anything that have specific testing for evidence-based wise for the area, or is that still being developed?
It's just starting right now. I mean, there's very little information. There's the Varnum law firm did 100 blood tests, and they only released the ones that were high. So, it's hard to make any. But the health department is doing 800 samples of blood, so we are going to get some information about that.
That's more of like a local.
It's a local study, yes. It's House Street area.
Gotcha.
So, but it just shows you the power of water exposure.
Were the results of that study made public?
They should be. Yeah. I mean, Varnum has a right not to produce the data, but the health department has to produce it. Yeah.
So if you go on their website, eventually you'll find it.
You should. I mean, they just are recruiting people to give blood. So
Okay.
it was just an article in the paper last night or 2 nights ago. Yes.
I talked with a person from Plainfield Township, headed up a lot of this information, and worked with a lot of the meetings and so on. And there's, in the Plainfield water, they talk about 3 parts per trillion. And some of the people have found sources about 2 parts per trillion. And right around House Street, there's some homes that reported well over 1,000 parts per trillion.
Yeah.
Now, how does this all affect someone that gets 3 parts per trillion are freaking out because they see something like that?
Yeah.
The testing is.
Well, just remember that 3 parts per trillion is in our water. Our water, Grand Rapids water, has 3.
So should everybody freak out if they live?
I don't think so. I don't think so. But it's sobering to realize that. Well, I'll talk about safe levels in a minute. So, any other questions?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So you talked earlier about the fact that drinking it is so much worse than being exposed to it. The workers at DuPont and 3M, I mean, obviously they had some extreme
It was inhalation,
exposure to it, but it's still relatively concerning, even not just drinking it, right? So if you are in an area with higher than safe levels or even borderline levels, is it okay to just protect your drinking water, or are you concerned about it for laundry and showers and?
It depends on the concentration, but if you're in the 70 parts per trillion range, I think laundry and showers are fine. But if you're in the thousands, probably not. Yes.
So Kent County is very susceptible to it for all the reasons you've been saying. Is it the worst here than anywhere in the country, you think? Or?
We're right up there. If you look at some of the highest levels reported in groundwater or in Kent County in the United States, some of the highest levels reported in blood are in Kent County. That one woman's blood was very, very high. So, but I'll draw a contrast. The airport, they sprayed thousands of gallons. I mean, there's all sorts of wild estimates on how much of that stuff was sprayed for firefighting drills. But the airport is clay, and they did find some PFAS in the homes that live down at the Thornapple River. That's a very nice area to live, but they don't have nearly the problem from PFAS being applied as the people on House Street, just because of the geology. Yes.
When it comes to selling homes, so am I wrong in thinking that I've attended a lot of the meetings at Township and a couple that you were.
Oh, okay.
Attended at
Yeah.
a few. Am I wrong in thinking that if you have any kind of a presence of PFAS in your water, you have it tested, you're trying to sell your home, if the seller puts in a whole house filtration system and can bring that level down to 0 or 1, kind of like with radon putting in a mitigation system.
It's the same thing, yes. It's the same thing, right? Or it's the same thing as putting in a reverse osmosis for nitrate. I mean, there's some areas that have too high nitrates, and they've got to put an RO system in.
Does RO take out PFAS or?
Well, it's interesting. It doesn't, not as effective as carbon. But the problem with RO systems is that they take out minerals and your water is more corrosive, and you know it's 6 of one, half a dozen of another on RO systems. I mean, if you've got bad plumbing and you have an RO system, you're going to be releasing lead.
Just for drinking water, let's say, it wouldn't really do much to PFAS.
Right. Well, yeah, it will not take out enough. It maybe takes out maybe 25 to 30%, not very much. So, yes.
Does any bottled water company test for PFAS?
That was a good question, and TVA surveyed some bottled water, and there was none in the bottled water. So, bottled water is regulated more than your drinking water. Bottled water has a lower lead limit than public water. Figure that one out. See everybody drinking bottled water. So, all right. Don't want to get too far off. I'm almost done with this, but I talked about that 100-fold increase, and there's quite a few studies. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that show somewhere between 100 and 150-fold increase of water to blood. So if you drink water, your blood is automatically 100 to 150-fold higher. It's not just one study. So that's a pretty well-known fact. And then what this particular person did was he took the mean amount of PFAS in people's blood too and said, what happens if you drank 1 part per trillion, 10 parts per trillion, 20, 40, 70? This is what or 100. This is what your blood would look like. So if you were drinking 100 parts per trillion, your blood would be up to 22. If you were drinking 40 parts per trillion, it'd be 10. So you can see that concentration compounding with exposure. So it's just not a good compound to have in your water. And I think if you're, in the 1 to 10 range, it's not going to raise your level very much. But when you start getting above that, you are going to have higher levels. And remember, it's the child, not necessarily the adult, that's of concern. Right now, the safe level is 70. If you're in New Jersey, it's 40. They've dropped it to 14 just recently. If you're in Vermont, it's 20, and the newest numbers from ATSDR are 11 and 7. So if you, everybody is measuring PFAS plus PFOA, so that would be about 20, about 18 parts per trillion. So this is a really good number. I mean, we thought the other number was pretty good until all the studies about fetal health and infants came out, and this is, probably a pretty good number. So, but again, all this is probable, and it's things seen in populations. You can't relate a concentration back to it, so that's confounding. Yes.
What is ATSDR?
Oh, that's the toxicity. I should know that, and Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. It's part of the CDC. And I'm showing my age that I couldn't recall that. But yes.
You mentioned that you thought the lead levels and the recommended lead levels were going to be dropped. What do you think they should be dropped to?
Most scientists will say 5, and they're at 15 now.
5
parts per billion. Yep. And again, that's based on childhood health. In terms of Rockford, I mean, we have these big cutout areas of contamination: the Woven area, House Street, the River Corridor, Boulder Creek, and then the 4-mile landfill in Boulder Creek over here. So there's quite a bit getting up into Algoma Township. Quite a bit of land that's contaminated. Not all the wells are contaminated in those areas, but they have the potential for being contaminated. And you can kind of say if they're not contaminated, now, after 40 years, they probably won't get contaminated. But it's really important to get an understanding of where the contamination is and why it's there. And the initial well that turned out positive was actually the National Guard. If that wasn't discovered, we probably would, be a couple years later, a year later, before it would have hit the newspapers. There's 50 square kilometers affected, 40 kilometers of river frontage, and there's disposal sites. Plainfield Township has it in there. Thousands of residents have contaminated groundwater. And this is just a picture of all the greens are wells that non-detects, and the yellows are the least, the orange, and then the reds are the most. And you can see there's lots of 1 to 10s. The yellows are 1 to 10 parts per trillion. But Wolverine is putting in whole house filters for everybody that's got a detected concentration. For a while, they were only putting them in at 70, but they've changed to putting them in at 1. So if you get a detection. So they would have to put one in every house in Grand Rapids because we all have 3. So, it's... there is a level that's safe, and we can't get excited about those really low levels because we've been drinking that for a while. So, yes.
This map shows inside the black lines is where the problem, where the plume is.
Yes.
Correct? Those houses that are just, because I happen to be one of them, just on the
Outside.
Black line, they don't have to worry then? Or
Well, it could be the plume hasn't gotten there, but the water is flowing this way, so if you're up here, probably it's okay. I don't know where we're.
I'm down lower.
We're at.
I'm over.
Over here?
Right in there. Yeah.
Oh, there's nothing that we know of that's over here, so yeah. But there could have been a dump there. So, any place you see a gravel pit, there's possibility that waste was dumped. This is House Street. A very defined plume in an old river channel, and you can see it. It went south, it went a little bit north, and then it just went down to the east on that river channel. The tannery has some of the highest concentrations that have been reported, 160,000 in the wells right next to the Rogue River. So if you sample the Rogue River, it's not that high, but I'm concerned about that wetland. There's all that foam in there and stuff, and kids play in that. This is the map of the 4-mile landfill and the Versluis wells. The Versluis wells have 700 parts per trillion in them, and some of those were used for Plainfield Township water at one time. And the strange thing is, when you start looking at how deep their wells are, everybody shows this line going here, but if there's a gravel seam underneath the river, Boulder Creek's right on the other side. So, they've got to get those kinds of things figured out.
Is this 4 mile, you said?
Yeah.
Because I was talking to the DEQ, and they said that they only had one well so far that has shown anything south of the Grand River. Is that kind of your understanding?
South of the Grand River? This is waste management, and they monitor.
Right, that's what they were telling me.
They have a whole bunch of wells right by Versluis Lake that are hot.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And those are the wells that they had to close down. And then it shows one over here of 350. I don't know. There's just not a good clearinghouse of information, which is bad. For home drinking water treatment, I said you can put in the whole house filter if you have small levels and you're concerned and you want to do the best for your child, or you're planning a family. There's nothing wrong with putting one of those in at your tap water if you just want to be extra sure. They're not that expensive. You can buy them at Amazon now for $200. So, but the one thing I do want to caution people though on putting in the RO system, because that does affect the minerals and makes your water more corrosive. So, but next steps, we really need to look at the current wellhead protection program and well permit process. We obviously did not protect our drinking water wells and did not permitted wells where they shouldn't have gone in. We need to investigate, get a better handle on neighborhoods. Maybe people need to have their water tested just like for radon. I mean, it's a $200 test on a $200,000 sale. I would rather see that. You know, my son just bought a house and he paid for the radon test, and he's happy it turned out low. So, but you know, that's not cheap. A radon test isn't cheap. We need that epidemiological study and look at the blood testing to get a handle on what's the exposures have been. People are looking at the fish in the river, Rogue River, to see how far that goes. And we need to do more public outreach. And Grand Valley and WEMEAC are looking at forming a public advisory council. And public advisory councils are clearinghouses for information. And we meet once a month and we get updates on all the different actions going on. And we have a public meeting. We invite the DEQ and things like that. So we want to try and form one of those. And there'll be more information coming out on that. But I think the more people understand, the more we talk about it. I mean, some of the stuff is pretty fuzzy and it's maybe difficult to understand, but you can see that the body of evidence is pointing to low levels being significant, but you know, there's obviously a limit of, you know, not being significant at very low levels. Yes?
You have two questions been waiting over there.
Okay, sorry.
I haven't.
Go ahead.
The environment itself, does it degrade over time?
No, it's stable. It just, nature looks at it and says, you know, I don't make anything with fluorine, so I'm going to leave it alone. So, yes.
I have a deal penny right now, right outside of a mapped area, and we had a PFAS test done because my buyer required it.
Yeah.
And the first test was done by Gordon, and it came back at 223. The health department stepped in and did a second test and claims we have to take their test as the factual test. Their test came back just under 70. So which test do you really believe when you've got two that say completely different things and now they don't qualify for a whole home system?
I thought they did. I thought they were.
No, because of the health department's test came back under 70, they don't qualify because they're outside of a mapped area.
Oh, outside of a mapped area.
Yep.
Yeah. No, if you're one in the mapped area, you do get one.
Right.
Yeah. I wouldn't drink water at 70. So, and you know, the 200 versus 70. I mean, if you're really close to that 70, it is going to go down. I mean, that ATSDR. I mean, the numbers in that report, even if they split the difference, and I mean, everything is pointing to a lower level. So, you know, something in the neighborhood of, you know, 20 maybe or 15. So. Yes.
What makes a area be able to get on that map? Because, for instance, north of what's on there, like Russell Ridge is a neighborhood that has tested positive, and it's not on the map.
Yeah, those are the ones that Wolverine has claimed responsibility for. So, and then they've only claimed responsibility because they've been caught red-handed. So, I mean, they disposed of the farmers took the sludge and put it on their land and stuff, and.
So it's more by dump site, not necessarily how people's water is tested?
Well, it's regulated by dump site that Wolverine has claimed responsibility for. So they, for example, they claim no responsibility for Boulder Creek. And anything down there, they're not going to put a well system in. So, yes.
So, can you talk a little bit about tests? Because, like, which tests are good and what you should use, what you should not use? That's been a hot topic, obviously.
I know, and I'm just going by, you know, anecdotal evidence, but I know Gordon Water has a nice deal, and I've talked to them about what they do, and I talked to the lab, and they seem to be, you know, pretty good at what they do. He takes the precautions of, you know, wearing the gloves and everything else about doing it. So, and then there's engineering firms that are, you know, professionals at that, and they're charging $600 to $700 to come out and sample your water. There is a lab in Holland that you can request a kit and sample it yourself, and it's $250.
Isn't there one that like Aaron Brockovich said is bad and like?
Yeah, they're right. You have to look at reputable companies.
Okay.
So Gordon uses PACE, which is a certified drinking water laboratory, and they're right in Grand Rapids. And the lab in Holland, I don't think has a certification, but they're a medical testing laboratory, and they again appear to be doing things, from what my understanding is, correctly. Yes.
So you think numbers are going to go down and maybe approach 20 or even lower? Is EPA also working on an MCL?
You're probably not going to get an MCL. You're going to get a guideline.
And that guideline obviously is going to be somewhere above the ambient, let's say.
It will be, yes. And right now, what's interesting is the EPA and the DEQ are testing the tannery for contaminants, and the EPA is testing for everything but PFAS, because PFAS is not regulated according to the federal government, but it's regulated according to the state. The state passed a law. So, I mean, well, you get into those weird situations where, you know, the feds say that they're not responsible, and then the state has to come in and do it. So, yes, I can't explain that.
Vacant land, vacant farmland.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way, because it does not have a well on it currently, or access to the underground water, is there any type of testing available for vacant farmland that somebody wants to develop?
You'd have to put in a well, yeah, or look at the wells in the general area, yeah. Yes.
You have, they isolated out New Jersey to identify safe water level. If they isolated New Jersey, what did they do for the nation? What is the nation thing?
Yeah. And that question was asked. We had a public meeting, and there was a resident that asked that question, and she got a really terrible answer from the health department. But you know, the health department said, you know, they're just adding more safety factors. But New Jersey was actually looking at the fetal health issues. So I mean, this was done. You know, the 2016 number is PFAS plus PFOA. The 2009 number is just PFOA, and they've dropped it. So I mean, 40. If you have PFAS and PFOA at 40, you know, it's similar to the EPA's number. But what I'm saying is that New Jersey can respond much faster than the federal government. So they, in 2016, they looked at newer data than what the EPA did. So, yes.
The states themselves, I'm sure they got that tabulation. You know, whether you're saying California and
oh, yeah,
all these other states, you don't have no idea what that number is?
For the state of Michigan?
Well, you isolate New Jersey.
Oh, no, I mean, there's numbers for a number of other states, right. And most of the states have taken 70 as the number, the federal guideline. But there's other states that are lower. Pennsylvania, I think, is a little lower. I think California is still at 70, though. And that, yeah, just a second. That ATSDR report's like 800 pages, and I mean, it's a very thorough report. So, yes.
If you had the same meeting a year from now, would your presentation be the same, or do you think?
Probably not. Yeah, I mean, the guts of it would be the same, but I'd be reporting more current data.
So then it'd be wise to have another meeting a year from now.
Oh, yeah. No, that's why what I like about the public advisory councils. Public advisory councils were formed for Muskegon Lake and White Lake and Kalamazoo River areas that have contamination problems, and they talk about it, review data, you know, once a month, and you know, people are informed a lot more than they are here. So, and it's hard to find this information on websites. I have trouble finding information. So, Yes.
I think in the legislature here in Michigan, they're working at lowering this.
Yeah.
Because I've talked with Winnie Brinks.
Yeah.
And they're trying really hard in Michigan to get that 70 lowered, she'd
Yeah.
like to lower it down to 5.
Yeah, she said 5, but
But I don't know that they're going to get it down.
yeah, I mean, you really have to look at studies to back it up. You can't just say, I want 5 because it's lower. You've really, there's a lot of evidence to show that those are good numbers. So, yes.
So you said earlier that there were, you were talking about the contaminated wells by Bristol's Lake, and that it fed into Plainfield Township water. So is somebody who living in Plainfield Township water, or Plainfield Township who didn't have a well but drank just the water that came to the house, could they have potentially been exposed?
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's what, there's a whole social media group out there about potential issues with Plainfield water, and some of that stuff they're asking good questions that they're not getting answers. So, yes.
When you talked about the Plainfield solution to their the filter that they put into their township water, you mentioned that it takes out PFAS, but that it doesn't necessarily take out other pollutants. And it kind of looked like maybe you knew something, like there was more to talk about.
Well,
like, is there specific ones that are known that are debated right now?
When Plainfield Township's water was studied, it's when they had the Versluis well going in it, and there was 1,4-dioxane and hexavalent chromium also found in their water, and the carbon won't take those out. So they shut that well down. I haven't seen results on their, they've got other wells, but they've got that by that gravel pit. There's a gravel pit on the other side of the road, but they dump their water treatment sludge in there. And if you look at the concentrations, the highest concentrations are next to the gravel pit, and then as they move away, the concentration goes down in the next series of wells. So nobody's tested the gravel pit yet. So it's just not a good place being right by that landfill. Yes.
So if we're selling a home in an area that maybe is in a watershed, so this question becomes, where is the watershed and or not, right, as it moves.
Mm-hmm.
So the seller pays for a well inspection or, test. And we're sitting there seeing that this meth situation recently drew a realtor into a lawsuit. So now we sell a home to, say, somebody from out of state that's in a watershed area, that does have a well, but they don't test for PFAS. Have you heard anything about litigation or no?
No.
So the question becomes, as our industry, as to how much do we need to disclose?
Yeah, it also, if it goes to court, it's, how much should you have known or should have known,
Or recommended.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my
So
favorite.
the question becomes, you may be in a watershed zone or you may not, right? So say you're not, and you don't declare, and you just let it go because it's not on the map.
Yeah.
But then it ends up being on the map, or it is on the map because it wasn't recently just.
I can't answer those questions, but those are going to come up because there's that Charter Academy school in Ionia that's just out. They can't figure out where it came from, but their levels were high. They had to shut it down. There's probably a agricultural dump or an old dump somewhere. I don't have answers to. That's why we just have to keep talking and working with the state government and whatnot.
So as realtors, we have lead-based paint pamphlets, we have radon
Yep.
pamphlets.
Need a PFAS pamphlet.
Thank you. Are we getting one, or?
I don't know. No, it's seriously, like I said, I'm much more afraid of radon. Anything radioactive is really well studied and positive, very, very, very positive that you get sick from it. I'm less concerned about this, but, if I was young and starting a family and everything, I'd put carbon on my well if I was in the Rockford area, just to be safe. Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about preemptively eliminating the PFAS out of the water or out of our diets. But what about after we've been exposed? Is there anything known that actually, so there's certain things you can take that will pull toxins out of your body?
I think all that for lead they have you take for lead they have you take chelating agents, and that I think those are all really not good treatments. I mean, your body does excrete it, and it's really hard to accelerate that excretion. Yeah.
Does the half-lives continue to cycle?
Yes.
Okay.
So it's 1/2 and then 1/4 in 20 years. So that lady that's up at 2,000, I mean, it's gonna take a long time. Yeah.
Yeah, but the half-life's assuming you're not ingesting anymore.
Right.
Right, so it's a continual rolling half-life.
Right, but if you're ingesting, a small amount, it's not going to add to that. But if you've got, 2,000 in your blood, it's going to take a long time.
The general rule of thumb, should we just be recommending that our clients get this test done? And to protect ourselves, we could have an addendum, like a waiver of those tests signed by them, so
Yeah.
we prove that we...
If I was in the Rockford, Belmont area, I would have my water tested. And that's a small expense on a nice home and everything.
What about anyone on a well in general? I mean, just to feel
Depending on where you're at,
Well, it seems like it's just spreading and
Yeah.
it's all over the place.
Well, I've never had my well tested because I'm in a confined aquifer. So, I mean, it's... Well, I know. But that's another thing is to, I mean, there's obviously wells that are more protected than others, and how do you ferret that information out? I mean, I could find that out, but all the well logs are available to the public. So you can look at that well log and determine whether it's confined or unconfined.
Where are those housed, by county or?
Yeah, the health department has the wells, but there's a website for that. And I got put to shame by Ken Coker. He was talking to me about the airport, and I didn't know anything about the geology. He pulled it up on his cell phone and said, "Oh, look at this, look at this." And he had the whole, all the well logs for the area. So, yes.
Back to my original question, did I miss it? Did you answer it? Like, if something tests clean now, and could it test clean? What's the, did you answer that
Yeah.
question?
Well, yeah, I thought I did, but obviously I didn't. But it depends on where you're at. If there's no known sites up gradient from you and you're well tested negative, then it shouldn't get contaminated. If they find something upstream, up gradient from you, then you have the possibility that, if you're in that line of the plume, then yes, it could be.
So I have a home in Rockford that I listed as closing, clean test, but we're close, but not, not real close, but we're close. And so that test could be no good after 3 months, or?
Well, not after 3 months. I mean, it could be no good after 10 years maybe, but, we always had, the baseline environmental assessments. Those were really big when I was in consulting firms, and those were done for purchasing properties, and you had to look at, what's in the general area. You almost have to do that by neighborhoods and, have a information database. Somebody needs to look into that. And well drillers, know a lot about the aquifers, even though they're not, qualified geologists. I mean, they will tell you. So. Any other questions? Yes.
So you said remediating the problem would be to remove all the water from the aquifer?
That's the only way to do it.
Are they talking about doing something?
No, they're going to let it go, and they're going to either put in public water or whole house filters. So what they're talking about for the Rogue River is they're going to put a trench along the Rogue River by the tannery and collect all the water seeping in and then pumping it out and treating it. They're not going to try and dig up the tannery property. So.
And then how would they treat? They would just have to treat the water
through carbon. Yeah.
If it could move underground,
30 feet, and I've heard up to 200 feet each year. How often do you recommend testing your water then?
Depends on your aquifer, and you can generalize based on whether your aquifer is sand or gravel. You know, there's ways to make those assessments. You know, I almost think there's going to be like an environmental house inspector. My son just had his house inspected, and he had the radon test and all that, and the guy did a really thorough job, and you almost have to have somebody with an environmental background go along with that person, and I don't know. If I was young, I'd start a business. Yes?
With all these private companies that do the water testing, does the state of Michigan collect that information so that they can start, because they all had different criteria of their testing.
Right.
Do they try to collect that?
I don't know what they're doing. Yeah. To me, I would collect them if they were done by reputable companies. I think, you know, the more data you have, the better. Yeah.
Realtors, just so you know too, your lenders are going to potentially have different policies for different areas. We have a Rockford policy, we have a Flint water policy as a lender, so check with your lenders because they could be different too.
Good point. Other questions? Well, I hope that my goal was to raise questions and bring up your level of understanding, and I hope I've done that. I can't answer a lot of questions, but you know, it's a significant occurrence in the Rockford area, and we just need to keep talking about it and taking action. So.